Hello, and welcome to the C-Suite Chronicles podcast. We're bringing you the top voices in tech leadership. I'm here with Cynthia Mason, Mia Lewin, and Natalie Egan, three badass women in tech who are also experts on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Cynthia is the founder and managing director of the Up Group, a Seattle-based female-owned boutique recruiting firm. Mia started her career as a venture capitalist and is a three-time CEO with 2 exits who currently sits on a number of boards of directors advising founders and startups. Natalie is a serial tech entrepreneur, and in her latest venture, she is the CEO and founder of Translator Inc., a live learning platform for train-the-trainer content developed and delivered with a DEI lens. On this episode of the C-Suite Chronicles, we're talking about creating inclusive cultures in the workplace, where people can feel safe to be their genuine selves and be productive at the same time. The show is jam-packed with nuggets of gold when it comes to building inclusive workplaces, where you can create an environment where your employees can not only perform at their best, but feel empowered to do so. If that's something you want to hear more about, stay tuned. I'm Robin Kurdick, and this is the C-Suite Chronicles. Cynthia, Mia, Natalie, welcome to the show. It's such a pleasure to have you. Why don't we start by just have you introduce yourself and give a brief background. Cynthia, you want to kick us off?
Sure. I am Cynthia Mason, and I longtime Seattle tech startup executive. 9 startups. I've been the head of global people, and then recently transitioned a year and a half ago to my own company called the Up Group, and we specialize in executive recruiting and HR consultancy.
Hi everyone. My name's Natalie Egan. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And Robin, thank you so much for having me. And I'm the CEO and founder of a company called Translator, and we build a DEI training technology, which is not necessarily part of the conversation today. But I do spend a lot of time in the space of helping people feel included in the workplace.
Yeah, so my name is Mia Lewin. I'm a 3-time founder and CEO with 2 exits. In my previous life, I was also investment banker exiting startups and then venture capitalist investing in startups. And after my last exit, I am now supporting founders and CEOs as a board member, advisory board member, advisor, and investor.
We're talking today about creating inclusive workplaces where employees feel safe to show up as their most authentic selves and be productive. Studies have shown that the benefits of hiring diverse talent are many: improved problem solving, more cohesive teams, and higher productivity, to name a few. And all of these result in a positive impact to the bottom line. But hiring diverse talent is only part of the equation. It's keeping that talent that matters. And people of color, individuals of Latin descent, and others are still underrepresented in many industries, especially in tech and especially in leadership. Once hired, diverse talent doesn't tend to stay in organizations because they don't feel included. And that's where the rubber meets the road. It's one thing to hire diverse talent, but it's quite another to create an inclusive workplace where that talent feels a sense of belonging and feels comfortable enough to be themselves. I think many leaders struggle with what it means to create an inclusive culture and how to bring that to fruition. And that leads us to our first question, which is, what does it mean to have an inclusive workplace? And I'd love it all if you all could give an example of that.
For me, I would say it's making it a safer, more productive environment for everybody, really being proactive in that, embracing diversity in every corner. I think being aware and constantly learning and educating the employee population and really having that level of forgiveness that's okay, removing kind of all the judgment. I think that it's really important to instill that into the employee population that, we're all on this education journey together and everybody's at different levels. So really embracing that that's part of the inclusion as well, not just the diversity side of it, but really that we're all on this journey together. So, and making it a proactive priority.
I think for me, from a startup founder perspective, it's really the psychological safety. that allows the people that they can really bring their best version of themselves and the really authentic version of themselves to work. And I think the question really is, how does it feel? You know when you have it. And for me, the feeling is really that you're in the flow. You don't need to pretend to be anybody else than you are. You feel safe in that environment.
What came up for me when you asked that question is the first reaction was that people pay a lot of there's a lot of lip service around like bring your whole self to work. But what they really are saying is like bring your whole self, but not the parts that I'm not okay with, or like the parts that I'm uncomfortable with. And so there's a real like issue with that. There's a lot of challenges with inside the idea of bringing your whole self to work. But for me, I feel like people want to feel seen. They want to feel heard. They want to feel respected. They want to feel valued. They don't want to be necessarily treated equally. Like, don't treat me as an underrepresented identity as a trans woman. I actually don't want to be treated equally as everybody else because I'm not actually on equal footing, and neither are most people of marginalized backgrounds. So when people say I don't see color, or I don't see gender, or I treat everybody equally, or like most people actually don't want to be treated equally because equality is in and of itself it's not real, right? That's where we get into the concept of equality versus equity, where equality is treating everybody equally. Equity would be, giving people the resources that they need based on their situation, their identity, their demographics, the things that are holding them back potentially in this world.
That's great. And I think that the variety of responses that you all gave were very insightful. You all kind of come at this from a different angle, and it's really interesting to hear your diverse perspectives. Let's talk a little bit about how inclusivity is related to diversity. Can you sort of elaborate on that? I think they are related, but I don't think people quite understand the correlation.
For me, I think diversity is, when I think about it, I think it's the people that make up your employee population, like the different backgrounds, the education, gender, race, where they grew up, all the wonderful, differences that help to bring different insights, perspectives into the culture, but also those perspectives that help to make your product and services more exceptional with all of the, cool things that are coming from different ideas, thoughts, and backgrounds. Where inclusion, on the other hand, when I think about it, is more the creation of a healthy work environment and culture that enables the employees to really participate, feel safe, thrive, and really feel like, that they can be their authentic self as much as they feel they should be at or want to be at work. And whether that's their whole selves or they separated and it's their work selves, they should still be able to, be able to open up that door, open up that Zoom, and feel comfortable, with their opinions and thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
Diversity for me is really about the numbers game. So that is really the makeup of the organization, as Cynthia said, and it's about analyzing the data, understanding the various representation of people, the compensation data, looking at the promotions, tenure, etc. And inclusion is really the feeling. How do the people feel in the organization? Do they feel heard? Do they feel seen? Are their contributions taken into account? And that's the biggest difference for me.
Yeah, so I would agree with everything Cynthia and Mia said. To me, diversity is more of a metric. I think people use that as a way to measure, sort of superficial diversity inside the organization. Like, it's like a lot of times I think of it as like diversity of labels, right? But I think if you look beyond diversity of labels, you can look at diversity of experience. There's a lot more to diversity than we oftentimes measure. But diversity in and of itself is not enough, as you all have already said. I mean, it gets down to inclusion, and whether companies want to call it inclusion or not, like we're seeing a backlash against DEI. But even for the people that are like triggered by the word DEI, or whatever their own baggage or issues are with DEI, they still want their employees to feel included. Right. So there's still an element of like, I still want my cake and eat it too here, but I want this idea of people feeling included, which is, as I said earlier, feeling valued, feeling respected, feeling seen, feeling heard. But it's kind of like everything that Mia and Cynthia already said. Like, it's just like, do I feel like I'm a part of the fabric of the organization? And not just a cog in the machine. That's like, those people are the ones that are quiet quitting. They're the ones that are checking out. Like, that's expensive, right? When people feel included, they want to stay. They're going to work harder and longer. And I don't mean this in a bad way, like we're taking advantage of them, but they'll work for less. Like, they won't take that bait and switch to go to another company because they feel included where they are. They're like, I get paid more over here, but I'm not going to take that risk to make the jump because I like where I am. And if you've got that type of retention, that's when people, to me, or that's where you're doing a good job with inclusion.
Yeah, I'd agree with that 100%. And on that note, why is inclusivity important to both employees and the organization? I think you touched on this, with the retention, and you all kind of mentioned this feeling. It's a feeling. It's not just a way of being. It's really, it's a feeling that you have, and you belong, and that you have that comfort level. And I'm wondering if there are other reasons why inclusivity is so important, and if there are any examples kind of from your real world experience that you can share with us.
I mean, for me, I talk about this all the time because it's so important and it's so simple that, inclusivity creates a sense of belonging among, peers, colleagues, coworkers, whatever term you want to use, that can translate into a bunch of things, which is, innovation and better decision making, team performance, all those things that a company wants. But really, really what it boils down to is that it improves how the employee feels and how more connected they become to whether it's their team, their boss, or the culture itself, or the company overall. And they're really happy. And happy employees are productive employees. And that's been proven over and over again. So if you can bring that belonging to each employee that you hire, and then hold on to that and really make them feel welcome and that they belong there, you're going to have happy employees and a low attrition rate.
I think my simple answer is that it's really, truly just better for the business. So you start with diversity, and if your population in a company is similar to the population of the potential customers and the market overall, you're going to have a better perspectives. If you have inclusion, where everybody feels heard, you're going to build better products. Well, better products will lead to more customers. More customers will lead to more revenue, and that leads to better shareholder value, and it leads to better organization, and there's less churn. So overall, just taking a business school perspective, it's better for the business. One of the things I'm super passionate about is how this relates to the startup ecosystem, having been both a VC and a startup founder. And one of the things that I think is a huge opportunity as we're talking about Washington startup community is the DEI in the startup ecosystem. And one of the things I'm passionate about changing one way or another is that since I was one of the 3 VCs, female VCs in London 20 years ago, the numbers haven't changed for the founders. So I had been a female founder, it's 2%, under 2% of the capital still going after 20 years for female founders. It's 1.5% for Hispanic founders. It is 1% for Black founders. If you look at female and Latina founders, that is 0.1%. But then when you look at the returns on the investment based on these businesses, that what I would call underrepresented or underestimated founders, they're way higher than equivalent of the male founders. So the women overall return about 78 cents on each dollar that's invested. If you look at the men, white men, it's 31 cents on that dollar. And overall, the underestimated founders return about 30% more than the male white counterparts. And this is based on BCG and McKinsey studies that have been well vetted. So if I think about not just the inclusion, but the DEI opportunity overall in the venture capital and the startup ecosystem, I look at that as a huge white space opportunity to make outsized returns for the industry overall. And there's been some initiatives like in California where there's new legislation where regulators are asking for diversity data of the founders from the VC industry. And these are small steps after 20 years to start changing this data. it's not sufficient based on kind of all the conversations we've had here with Natalie and Cynthia, but it is the first step to the right direction, because exposing that data will have much more transparency and hopefully also lead to some action.
Right, and accountability too.
Yeah.
Yeah, Mia, thank you for sharing that, and Cynthia, thank you for kicking us off. And in particular, just on the note of the metrics there, the numbers. I mean, transgender founders aren't even showing up. Like, you can't even put it on a percentage. Like, it's not even there, which is really sad. And there's a lot of potential in our market. I tell you, there's a lot of really smart trans people out there just don't even have to get a chance. And I'm very fortunate to be one of the few venture capital backed trans founders out there. But there's a lot of trans entrepreneurs, right? And for the purposes of survival, not for the fame and glory of trying to build a huge startup. But a lot of us don't understand the principles and mechanics of building a SaaS business, that it needs to have these multiples and grow in this spectacular way. There's a huge opportunity there, I believe, very deeply in. But back to the topic or the question, for me, just everything that Cynthia and Mia said, plus I would just say, like, the one thing I talk about a lot these days is it's not just inclusion is a good business. It's good business, but it's also a mental health issue. And I think increasingly companies are becoming very concerned about the mental health of their employees, from the leadership down to the front lines. And again, whether you want to call it diversity, equity, inclusion or not, right? If you want a better mental health in your organization, the principles of DEI apply, especially in the topic of inclusion. And so I don't know if you all have seen this, but in May of 2023, the U.S. Surgeon General declared loneliness an epidemic, saying it was going to kill more people than smoking a pack of cigarettes a day, right? And like, companies are really worried about this with hybrid, work from home, remote workforces, like onboarding, employees. Huge percentages of their employees are being onboarded virtually, right? It's like, welcome to our company. Now here's 8 hours of e-learning, right? Like, it just doesn't work. You're not building relationships with other people, and you're not building a relationship with the organization. You're oftentimes, struggling with your own world, right? So, how do I help my employees feel included, and connected to each other, let alone to themselves, right? That's a big problem and a big opportunity.
I think this mental health thing is a huge issue for employers and employees. Are there other key elements of an inclusive workplace culture that allow employees to bring their most authentic selves to work? And again, if there are any examples of that you're able to share, that would be great.
I mean, I think some of it we've touched upon, but I think it's really important for employees to have a voice and then to take action on that voice. So whether that's through employee, the word just escaped me, surveys. So through employee surveys, or through those one-on-ones, or through, all hands and taking Q&As, whatever that might be. But I think having a voice and taking action makes them feel like there's a voice. Again, going back to that, sense of belonging and feeling valued. I think some of those are really important. And some of that really boils down to, learning and development opportunities inside the organization that we touched on the last question. Like, it's so important to stay on top of that, especially because the world is changing rapidly, and even more so with, what happened and what we learned in the pandemic, and still now with hybrid and working from home and what that feels like. And it's just changing so much faster, that I think that it's important to stay ahead of the curve there. And again, really, listen to the employee's voice and have them feel valued, and make sure that you're, giving all those opportunities for learning and development, along with, I think, lastly, a collaborative environment, I think, is super important too, to help the employees feel connected, but also to really bring those thoughts and ideas together, with that, whether that's in their own departments or across departments, so that, again, back to voices are being heard, they're being involved with their employees. That's kind of the first things that pop into my head.
For me, there's the internal and then there's the external. And internally, it's not just accepting the differences, but hopefully celebrating the differences. And then there's the protection, which is that even externally with some of your partners, for example, if there are huge violations of some of those core values, you have to take a stand because your employees will need to know that you're going to be always on their side, you have their back, and you're going to stand behind the values that you put out there. So some of the best companies and startups I've seen actually taking very strong stand when they've seen any misbehavior or things going against the inclusive values that they live and breathe by.
Three things kind of come to mind for me. One is at the most basic level, it's like there's like, so I sort of see it as a continuum of like lo-fi to maybe hi-fi, or like analog versus like tech based. But I think just being able to like really install this idea of like inclusive meetings in your company, right? Like how to run an inclusive meeting, like really basic management stuff. But there's literally like, you can Google like checklist for inclusive meetings and use that like immediately in the next Zoom meeting that you have. And I think that Zoom environment makes it even more important to make sure that people's voices are heard, that people have an opportunity to speak up. It's easy to kind of, for people to hide, either intentionally or unintentionally, or to be sort of spoken over and not listened to in a Zoom environment. So I would say inclusive meetings is probably part one. Part two is sort of really understanding people's unique learning profiles, or unique kind of like operating profiles, maybe is a way to think of it. A friend of mine started a company called Luna. It's LLUNA. And they have a product. It's part of their whole suite, but they have a side product called a personal operating profile, which basically just says like, here are the ways that I would like to be engaged with. Like, here are the times of day that I work, and here are the things that this is the best way to communicate with me. And, just really basic like understanding of your employees will make them feel included. They feel like people understand me. I feel like I can operate at this space. And then the third, and I wasn't looking for an opportunity to say shamelessly plug my company, but when it presents itself, I do. Companies like mine, like we build, technology designed around collaborative learning, right? So e-learning, asynchronous learning is kind of what we call lonely learning. It's learning by yourself. There's a whole new field of technology that's growing out there. We call it live learning, but some people, the category is collaborative learning. But it's the idea of how do we bring employees together to learn in cohorts, to learn together, to learn in real time, rather than e-learning, which is, again, isolating. It's lonely learning. So there's a lot of new technology there. I would encourage people to explore those new technologies to help in a world where we are hybrid and remote. How do we use technology to create a more inclusive environment? Not just talk about it, or not just, try and do a happy hour on Fridays when not everybody drinks, or what other sort of these things that are tired and aren't working. So I would say explore new technologies.
To piggyback on that, what Natalie just said, that is super helpful with the data that comes back from that too, right? To help to educate even your leadership team, or to find out where the employee population is at on their journey, or you will learn things that you had no idea, that there are pockets of love that needs to be given to a certain category of an employee, or a certain topic to an employee where maybe it wasn't top of mind to the leadership team or to the training team or whoever's involved in that. So the data that comes out of that is just incredibly rich and valuable.
That's great. That was actually my next question is, how can leaders play a role in fostering that inclusivity and within their teams and organizations? And I think you hit the nail on the head there, pay attention to that data and then translate that into actionable steps that they can use to make employees feel more included and feel that sense of belonging and like they have a place in the organization. I think that's great. Anything else that you all wanted to add to that?
I believe in leading by example. I think everything flows from top to bottom. And we do a lot of these initiatives bottom top, and that can be helpful, but it doesn't change things as fundamentally than when it actually starts with the leadership being diverse and inclusive, including the board, including the investor sets, and then hiring the leadership team underneath the founders, and then inhibiting all of these cultural values day in and day out. And that is just simply the easiest way to create change. If you don't walk the walk, you're just talking the talk, it's not going to be real. And that's just simplistic perspective from me.
Yeah, I totally agree. I say that all the time, lead by example, whether that's the leadership team or the next level down or the next level down, or even peer to peer. Like if we're all leading by example, it's easier for the believability to be felt across, the departments, cultures, employees. I think that is really important. So really good point, Mia, for sure. And I think also, proactively acknowledging and celebrating the differences that employees bring to the table. And whether you do that in your one-on-ones or all hands, but really celebrating the employees and all the cool things that they bring to the table.
Yeah, so I was just going to add to that, and I think Mia, you hit the main point that I wanted to say is that it really does need to start at the top, or it needs to be reinforced heavily from the top, even if it started from the bottom. You need buy-in from both sides, really. But I would say, two other things that come to mind that are really important, especially that can be very challenging for organizations, especially when we talk about like having buy-in from the leadership, is like having representation at the leadership level in organizations where you just don't have. It's like you can't just magically make diverse representation happen at the leadership level of your organization. And one of the things I've seen quite a bit that I think is a really nice sort of creative way of bringing in diverse representation, in particular for these organizations, is inside of ERGs or BRGs, so business resource groups or employee resource groups, is to bring in outside consultants that are like part of that group. In order to be it, you have to see it, right? And like, if I don't see anybody as a transgender or gender non-conforming person at the top of my organization, it makes me feel like I can't get there. But if I start to see, somebody of a very high level of influence with a high title, even if they're a consultant coming in from the side, but they feel like they're part of the organization, it does change the dynamic quite a bit because they start to feel like the organization. And anyways, I don't want to ramble too much about it, but that's just one of the little tricks I've seen that's starting to work really well.
No, I think that's great. And I think you all sort of answered this already, but for organizations that are just kind of starting out on this journey, particularly when it comes to creating inclusivity, are there other things that they should consider beyond the things that you mentioned, bringing in an outside perspective and acknowledging employee accomplishments and leveraging these, ERGs and BRGs and some of the other things that you mentioned? Is there anything else that folks should be thinking of? I mean, very early days, very early on in that journey, is there any sort of way they can lay the foundation?
There's three things that I would say is, and I've already talked about one of them a little bit, is representation, right? So representation matters. Like I would say, install that into your organization in every opportunity that you possibly can. Whether it's in ERGs or in speaking opportunities or diverse representation of vendors, suppliers, representation in your hiring practice, and the search, your representation in the search for new employees, making sure that you have diversity of the candidates there, and that you have a great equitable process behind that. So representation really matters. The second thing is that allyship really matters. So teaching allyship actively inside the organization. Most people think that they're allies. Like if I ask most people and say, "Are you an ally?" They'll say yes. But if you really drill in, it's like everybody's kind of got an allyship continuum. Like they're more of an ally towards one or two causes. It's like so kind of auditing where you are on that allyship continuum and sort of understanding where you can be a better ally. And then really think of that from an organizational level. Like where's our organization maybe indexing or over indexing on allyship, where there's these other areas like ability, and LGBT status and, for different, people of color. Like there's a lot of categories of allyship. Even things like formerly incarcerated people, right? Like where are we really like investing, and where do we stand in the allyship continuum? And then the third is language, right? So representation, allyship, and language. So language really matters. The words that we say, the words that we use, the words that we write, the words that the like language shows up in so many different ways, right? Like there's Zoom language, right? There's coding language, and language has the ability to make us feel included or not excluded. In fact, everything happens through language. That's like a big meta argument that I'll make. But if everything happens through language, let me tell you, we have to be careful with our language. And so all those little nuances of language, from sharing pronouns to using non-gendered language to how we like make eye contact with people, and the code that we write, like all of that matters. If we want people to feel included or excluded. And it's just like a subtle switch. It's just like tiny little switch between inclusion and exclusion. And it happens through language. So those are my three things: representation, allyship, and language.
Yeah, the language for me is number one, and I write it everywhere and I talk about it everywhere because it is in everything. I mean, even from the very beginning of when you're putting together a job description, writing that and having that be inclusive, so that one, that's your first touch to a potential employee that could come into your organization and actually join your employee population, and how you first reach out to that potential employee represents what's going on inside. And is this a culture and environment that they feel like that they could belong into? So just to piggyback on that, I think, inclusive language is so important, whether it again back is to the Zoom meetings or your face-to-face meetings or leadership meetings or your one-on-one meetings, like how you really communicate with the employees inside of the company and leadership or employees. So everybody and how you train and how you write that, and it's everywhere. So for me, it's such a big one. And I just will reiterate again, I think that educating the employee population is a continued investment that is, just so necessary for folks to stay on their journey and to really understand, to understand their own journey, but also to understand their peers better too.
My answer is probably not from an organization perspective, but as an industry overall. So going back to the venture capital and startup ecosystem, we're in the infancy of the whole DEI. And I think there's only two things that really matter. One is if you do manage capital, invest in diverse founders. It starts there. And number two, if you are not investing real money, then you can invest your social capital. So I have a rule of thumb of always try to make at least one introduction that can be helpful for underestimated founders, and that can go a long way. So I hope that overall as an industry we'll come together to start creating this change.
Love it. So great answers. In the few minutes that we have left, wanted to talk a little bit about how organizations can measure and assess their progress when it comes to creating an inclusive workplace. I feel like there's a lot of intangibles here, but are there any essential metrics that they can use kind of as a minimum? I'd presume retention might be one of those.
I mean, yeah. So I think putting together some type of actionable framework, to evaluate performance against goals is one, and then how do you do that? What should that framework look like? I mean, it should include a bunch of things such as, metrics that measure progress in diversity and inclusion, and some of those and initiatives. And some of that can come from, the employee surveys and what are the questions that you're putting out there. Certainly, as I just alluded to, in the recruitment and hiring practices, that is a huge way to measure that. And all your diversity and inclusion initiatives, have those interviews with new hires, 30, 60 days in, and, are we actually walking the walk? And then all of that adds to, are you looking at what is your pay gap? What is your compensation philosophy in the company, and are you truly following it? And are you updating it biannually or annually, so that, again, you're actually doing what you say you're doing, and you're leading by example. And then I think it also goes back to the happiness. And I don't remember who said it was Mia or Natalie, but you can feel that. You can feel a good culture and happiness of your employees across the company. One of the things that leadership or, one of the complaints that come into HR, it'll be the company just feels, it feels yucky right now. I feel like people are unhappy, and you can feel that whether people are saying it or not, that energy level is down. So keep your finger on that pulse too. It's so important to take action on your employees' happiness too.
I think the simple answer is the qualitative analysis and the quantitative analysis. Beyond what Cynthia said, I think there's nuances in that quantitative analysis. So when you look at, for example, compensation or promotional data, you need to kind of peel the onion and go to the next level and look at how long did it take for certain minorities to get promoted, for example? How long did they need to wait for that pay parity to actually be realized? So it's about having a very deep look at that data, not taking the numbers on its surface value.
Yeah, I mean, from where I sit, I think this is the huge gap. Like, there's not a lot of great metrics. There hasn't been, and it's also a huge opportunity. And that's, a big part of the reason I started my company is to sort of focus on, like, how do we make this stuff data driven so that we can measure it? Say if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. And if you can't measure it, like, people will get tired of it. Like, there's sort of a fatigue that happens. So I do think there's a lot of opportunity here. I think at the most simple level, if you don't have the systems or the resources to start to explore new technologies that are being innovated out there, one of the most simple metrics you can look at is like diversity referrals. Like, are you getting them? Right? You may have diverse employees or employees of diverse backgrounds who work for you, but are they just hanging on? Are they just staying there, like keeping the seat warm with their butt? Or are they actively referring people into your organization? And what you'll find, especially, and I love how Mia keeps saying underestimated, but I'll just say, for the sake of the way I usually say it, for underrepresented, more marginalized employees in particular, like, usually if they don't feel seen and they don't feel heard and they don't feel respected, they're certainly not going to refer their friends who look like them or are like them to the organization. I just use myself as an example. As a transgender woman, if I feel barely tolerated or barely accepted, or people are constantly misgendering me and I don't feel seen, I don't feel like I'm heard in the meetings where I'm contributing, I've got a huge network of transgender and gender nonconforming people that are probably also miserable in their jobs, by the way, that I could refer to come work for my organization, but I'm not going to do that no matter how much money you put on the table. Like, you could give me a referral bonus and I'm not going to take it because I wouldn't do that to my friend. And I've heard this conversation like over and over and over in all kinds of different communities of more marginalized experience. So I don't want to speak for them, but I'll speak for me as a trans woman. Like, absolutely not. But if you start to move the dial there, you'll see if you have diversity referrals coming in organically, you've got something going for you. But beyond that, again, I would implore, really push people to start to invest, explore, experiment with new technologies that are designed to do these things. And so that would be what I would tell people is create some budget there and let your employees go experiment, because we don't know what's going to work and what's not going to work in a lot of ways, right? There's a lot of innovation happening right out there. So you got to go out and find it.
Let me just touch on what Natalie just said too, on two things that you just said. One is the employee referral thing is huge. That's one of the metrics that we measure on, are the employees happy? If they're organically bringing them in, we've done experiments where we dropped the employee referral fee to 0, like that's part of your job. And is that working? Or we raise it higher because we're not getting any. And then what we realized was we need to ask the employees that question, like, would you refer family or friends, not just an old colleague, but family or friends to work at this company, and why or why not? And really taking action and listening on that. Like, that's going to help you to move the needle and for them to see it. And then the second part of that is the data and investing in those tools. We all work in technology. This is the, WTIA, these are all technology companies. every technology leader that looks at numbers, that makes sense to them. So if you're not providing them with data and it's warm and squishy HR stuff, it's going to be fluff and it's going to be whatever it might be. Sure, here's a little bit of budget to go and do this. But if you invest and come back with actual, real, tangible data, they're going to look at it a lot harder, and you're probably going to get a little bit more budget because, it's data, it's hard facts.
Awesome. Well, this has been an amazing conversation. Thank you all so much for sharing your perspectives. I think y'all knocked it out of the park. So thank you so much. If you liked what you heard on today's podcast, please subscribe on Apple or Spotify and leave us a review letting us know what you think. And please share this content with your peers on your social media channels and in other ways that it'll reach as many people as possible. Our goal is to help more founders achieve success more quickly, and the best way to do that is by sharing our collective knowledge. A rising tide lifts all boats, and the more the WTIA tech community can help and support one another, the better.